6 stone jars stood along a wall in a village house in Galilee, and they were the least interesting thing in the room until the wine ran out. Nobody would have looked at them twice. They were water jars. They were there for washing. They were heavy. They were the sort of fixture a household owns for 30 years and never thinks about, and they were made of stone at a time when almost every other vessel in that house was made of clay. That last detail is not decoration. It is the reason the story happens where it happens, and it points at something about how these people lived that most of us have never been told. So this is a slow walk through one wedding: what it cost, how long it lasted, who paid, what the guests drank, why the jars were made of stone, and what it meant to a family in a small village to run out of wine in front of everybody. It is the 3rd day of something, and there is a wedding in Cana of Galilee. That is how the account opens, and it opens the way village life actually arrives, without ceremony, in the middle of a week at somebody's house. The mother of Jesus is there. Jesus is invited, and so are his disciples, which tells you the family is known to them and that this is not a small formal occasion, but the ordinary kind, the kind where the invitation extends outward through a village until most of it is standing in the courtyard. Khirbet Cana sits about 9 miles north of Nazareth, on a ridge above the Beit Netofa Valley, and it is the site most archaeologists now think is the Cana of the Gospel. It was a real village, occupied in the 1st century, with rock-cut cisterns, an olive press and a synagogue, and a road running past it toward the coast. There is an older tradition that puts Cana at Kaffa Cana, which is much closer to Nazareth and much easier to reach, and which has received pilgrims for centuries. Both places have a claim, and the honest position is that we do not certainly know which one it was. What we can say is that both are the same kind of place, a hill village of perhaps a few hundred people, terraced fields, one press, one water source, and everybody related to everybody. That matters more than the map reference, because the size of the village is the size of the problem. In a settlement of that scale, there is no such thing as a private embarrassment. Start with the walk, because the story begins with a family traveling. From Nazareth to either candidate site is a morning. You go down out of the Nazareth ridge, across the valley floor where the soil is good and dark, and the wheat is grown, and up again on the far side. It is 9 miles, more or less, over ground that rises and falls, and a family in no particular hurry would do it in 4 or 5 hours. You would not travel alone. You would travel with whoever else was going, and the going itself was part of the occasion, a small procession of relatives arriving together in the afternoon, dusty, carrying whatever they had brought, which would not have been wrapped presents, but food and drink and things a household could use. And when they arrived, they were not arriving for an evening. This is the first thing that has to be corrected, because it changes the whole shape of the event in your mind. A wedding in this world was not a service followed by a meal. It was a week. The betrothal usually stood for about a year before the wedding, and it is not what a modern engagement is. It is worth being careful here, because the words in English mislead badly. There were 2 stages. The first was the betrothal, in Hebrew, kiddushin, the setting apart. It was a legal act. It was witnessed. It involved a payment or a formal declaration, and from the moment it was done, the couple were legally married in every respect, except that they did not yet live together. The bride stayed in her father's house. The groom went back to his work. The consequences of that are worth holding on to. A betrothed couple could not simply change their minds. To end a betrothal required a formal writ of divorce, exactly as ending a marriage did. Unfaithfulness during the betrothal period was treated as adultery, not as a broken promise. A betrothed girl could be legally widowed before she had ever kept house with her husband. If he died during that year, she was a widow in law, with a widow's standing and a widow's claim on his estate, though she had never lived under his roof or eaten at his table. That is how binding the first stage was. And it usually lasted about 12 months. The year had a practical purpose. The groom was expected to use it to prepare a place, in most cases not a separate house, but rooms added onto his father's, because families built outward around a shared courtyard as sons married. The bride used it to prepare, and her family used it to assemble what she would bring with her. Which is where the paperwork comes in, and where we can stop reasoning from custom and look at an actual document. Babatha was a Jewish woman who owned date palms at Mausa, on the southern shore of the Dead Sea, in the early 2nd century. She was widowed, remarried, went to law repeatedly over her son's guardianship and her orchards, and she kept every document. When the revolt came, she fled with her neighbors into the caves in the cliffs above the Nahal Hever, carrying her papers in a leather pouch, and she did not come out. Yigal Yadin was the archaeologist who went into those caves. Yadin brought the letters out of the Cave of Letters in 1961, 35 documents belonging to one woman in Aramaic, Nabatean, and Greek, sealed in a bundle and preserved by the dryness of the desert for 1,800 years. It is one of the most extraordinary survivals in the archaeology of the ancient world, and its value is precisely that it is ordinary. These are not royal decrees. They are a woman's land registrations, loan notes, court summonses, guardianship petitions, and marriage contracts, the paperwork of a normal life, from the generation after the Gospels, from a Jewish family living the same law. Her marriage contract is written in Aramaic, and it opens with a formula that any Jewish reader would recognize instantly, because it is still in use. The husband declares that she will be his wife, according to the law of Moses and the Judeans. That single clause is the frame the whole document hangs on, and it is the same clause that stands at the head of a ketubah written this year. The rest of it is money, and that is not cynical, it is protective. The contract specifies what the husband owes her: food, clothing, and maintenance. It specifies what she brings and what happens to it. Crucially, it specifies what she is owed if the marriage ends, whether by divorce or by his death. That last provision is the whole point of the institution. A marriage contract in this world was not a romantic instrument. It was a widow's insurance policy, written at the wedding, held by the wife's family, and enforceable in a court. It existed because a woman without a husband and without documents had almost nothing, and everybody involved knew it. So when a village family married a daughter, there was a document, there were witnesses, there was a sum written down, and there was a father on the other side of the room who had negotiated it. This is not the soft focus scene we tend to imagine. It is a legal event with a party attached. And the party is the part that will bankrupt you. Before the feast there is the fetching, and this is the piece of the custom that has left the deepest mark on the language of the New Testament. At the end of the betrothal year, the groom went to collect his bride, and he did not go quietly, and he did not go alone. He went with his friends, in procession, usually in the evening, with lamps and torches, and whatever music the village could produce, and the point of the noise was that everybody should know. We can be confident about the shape of it because a parable turns on it. 10 young women wait with lamps for a bridegroom who is delayed, and 5 of them have not brought enough oil, and the cry goes up at midnight that he is coming, and they go out to meet him. That story only works as a story if its hearers already knew that a wedding began with a night procession, a delay, and a shout. The bride was veiled for it. That is old, and it is deliberate. Rebekah covers herself when she first sees Isaac, and Jacob's whole misfortune with Leah depends on the fact that a veiled bride at night could not be identified until the morning. The veil was not shyness, it was part of the form. There was a crown as well, at least at some weddings and in some periods. The Song of Solomon speaks of going out to see the king with the crown his mother crowned him with in the day of his espousals, and Isaiah reaches for the same image when he wants to describe joy, as a bridegroom decketh himself with ornaments, and as a bride adorneth herself with her jewels. And there was a specific companion, an office rather than a friendship. The friend of the bridegroom stood by, arranged things, and listened for him. John the Baptist reaches for exactly that figure to describe his own position. The friend of the bridegroom, which standeth and heareth him, rejoiceth greatly because of the bridegroom's voice. So the week begins with a walk through the village in the dark, with lamps, toward a house where everyone is already waiting. Then the doors close and the feast starts, and it does not stop for 7 days. We know the feast ran for 7 days, not for an afternoon, and we know it from 2 places in the Hebrew Bible, both of which describe the custom as though it needed no explanation. Laban, the father of the bride, gives Jacob an instruction after the business with Leah and Rachel. Fulfill her week, and we will give thee this also. Finish the 7 days of this wedding, and then the second marriage can proceed. The week is assumed. Nobody explains it because everybody knows it. Samson held a feast, for so used the young men to do, and the account in Judges tells us it lasted 7 days, and that 30 companions were brought to keep him company, and that the riddle he set them was to be answered within those 7 days. The same week, 4 centuries earlier, at the other end of the country. 7 days of hosting. Think about what that actually requires from a household in a village of a few hundred people. Not 7 days of a modern reception, but 7 days of an open house. Food, a place to sit and drink for however many people arrive, with the numbers swelling in the evenings and on the Sabbath. And a week of feasting has a Sabbath in it. There is no arrangement of 7 consecutive days that avoids one, which means that somewhere in the middle of every wedding in that country, there was a day on which nothing could be cooked, nothing carried, no work done, and the guests were still there. That had to be prepared for. The food for the Sabbath was made the day before, the lamps were lit before sundown, and the house went quiet in the middle of its own celebration for a day and a night. Then it started again. It is a small thing, but it tells you the rhythm was not one long escalating party. It rose, it stopped completely, and it resumed, and the household had to have provisioned for both halves. The family did not do this alone, and this is the part that is hard for us to feel properly. A village wedding was underwritten by the village. Neighbors brought grain, oil, wine, cheese, dried fruit. Somebody lent a room. Somebody's wife made bread for 2 days. The obligations went in every direction, and everybody was keeping a quiet mental ledger, not out of meanness, but because that ledger was the only insurance any of them had. That is what a gift economy is. You give at your neighbor's wedding because your daughter will marry in 3 years, and the giving is not generosity so much as deposit. Which means the host's obligation runs the other way too. Having accepted all of it, he owed the village a proper week. So now hold the situation in your hand, a binding contract, a negotiated settlement, a whole village that has contributed and is now sitting in the courtyard. And somewhere between the 3rd and the 7th day, the wine runs out. Mary, the mother of Jesus, is the one who notices, and the way she notices tells you she is close to the family. Guests do not know how much wine is left. Guests do not go near the store. The people who know that the wine is failing are the household and the women helping the household, and she is among them. We should be honest about how bad this was, because the modern ear hears a catering problem. It was not a catering problem. It was a public failure of hospitality, in a society where hospitality was the whole basis of a family's standing. Running out meant the host had misjudged, or had been mean, or could not afford what he had undertaken. It would be remembered. It would be mentioned at the next wedding. In some periods, there is evidence that a guest could bring a claim against a host who failed to provide what the occasion required, because the guests had brought gifts in expectation. Whether or not anybody sued, the shame was real and it lasted, and the bridegroom would carry it. There is also the matter of who the failure lands on. The bridegroom is the host. It is his week. Whatever the cause, more guests than expected, a poor vintage, a father-in-law who overcommitted, the man standing at the center of that courtyard is the one who will be spoken about. The obvious modern question is why nobody simply went and bought more, and the answer is in how wine was made. Wine came once a year. The grapes were harvested in late summer and early autumn and trodden in a press. And in this country, the press was very often not a wooden machine, but a shallow floor cut directly into the limestone, with a channel running down into a lower vat also cut into the rock. You can still walk over dozens of them in Galilee and Judea. They are the most durable thing any of these villages left behind. The juice ran down the channel, settled in the vat, and was carried away in jars to ferment. By spring it was wine, and it was in storage, and that was the supply. There was no more until September. A household's wine for a wedding had been set aside months before, from a quantity fixed by a harvest nobody controlled. Which means that running out was not a failure of shopping. In a hill village at the wrong time of year, there was no shop, no merchant with stock, and no neighbor with a surplus large enough to matter, because every household store was calculated for its own year. If you had underestimated, you had underestimated in the autumn, and the correction was not available in the spring. That is why the situation in that courtyard was closed. It was not awkward, it was finished. The exchange that follows is 4 sentences long, and people have argued about it for centuries, so it is worth reading slowly and without importing a tone. She tells him simply that they have no wine. That is all. She does not ask for anything. It is the way you speak to someone in a household when you both already know what the sentence means. His reply in the older English sounds harsh. "Woman, what have I to do with thee? Mine hour is not yet come." The address itself is not rude in the Greek. It is the ordinary respectful way of speaking to a woman, and he uses the same word to her from the cross. What the reply does is mark a distance between what she is asking and the timing of something else. something the gospel will keep referring to as his hour, all the way to the end. And she does not argue with him. She turns to the servants and says one line, and it is the last thing the gospel ever records her saying: "Whatsoever he saith unto you, do it." There is a great deal packed into a mother deciding not to press the point and instead to prepare the staff. She does not know what will happen. She simply arranges for the household to be ready to obey an instruction that has not been given yet, which is a very particular kind of confidence. And it is at exactly this point that the account stops to describe the furniture, which is the sort of detail that makes an ancient text feel suddenly like a photograph. There were 6 of them, standing along a wall, and the text is specific in a way it does not need to be. 6 water pots of stone, set there after the manner of the purifying of the Jews, containing 2 or 3 firkins apiece. Each jar held 2 or 3 meters, which is somewhere near 100 liters at the upper end, because a meters is a Greek liquid measure of roughly 40 liters. 2 meters is about 80, 3 is about 120. These are not jugs, they are cisterns you could not move once filled. 6 jars at that size come to something like 600 liters of capacity, standing along one wall of a village house. And they were full of water, for washing, which is the ordinary and unremarkable reason a household would own them. Now the question the text raises and does not answer, because its first readers did not need it answered. Why were they made of stone? Stone is a terrible material for a water jar. It is enormously heavy. It has to be carved rather than thrown, which means a lathe or a chisel and a great deal of labor, where a potter can throw a clay jar in minutes and fire 100 at once. A stone vessel costs many times what a clay one costs. Nobody would choose it for convenience. They chose it for law. And the rule is written down plainly in the Mishnah, in the tractate that deals with vessels. Vessels of dung, vessels of stone, and vessels of unfired earth are not susceptible to uncleanness. To understand why that sentence was worth carving stone for, you have to go back to Leviticus, where the rules about vessels and ritual impurity are set out. A clay vessel that contracts impurity cannot be cleansed. Water will not fix it. It must be broken. That is a severe rule, and it has an obvious economic consequence. If your household water jar becomes ritually impure, and there were many ordinary ways that could happen involving illness, childbirth, a dead creature falling in, contact with something unclean, then the jar is finished. You break it and you buy another. Stone was the loophole, and it was a loophole with authority behind it rather than a dodge. Stone, being neither fired clay nor a manufactured absorbent material, was held not to contract impurity at all. A stone jar could not become unclean, which meant it never had to be broken, which meant that over the life of a household, it was cheaper than the clay jars you would otherwise be smashing. So the 6 jars in that room are not a decorative flourish. They are a household's considered investment in keeping the purity rules of Israel in a small village, made once expensively to last a lifetime. And here is the part that turns this from an interesting reading into something you can go and look at. We are not guessing about any of this because the workshops have been found. Jonathan Adler is the archaeologist who has spent his career on the physical evidence of Jewish ritual law, what people actually did, as opposed to what the texts say they should have done. Stone vessels are one of his subjects, and they are unusually good evidence because a fragment of carved chalk is unmistakable and it does not travel far. Chalk vessel fragments turn up in enormous quantities across Judea and Galilee, in Jerusalem, in villages, in farmhouses, in poor houses as well as rich ones. Tens of thousands of pieces, mugs, bowls, trays, and the big lathe-turned jars of the kind the account describes. There was a major production site at Hisma, north of Jerusalem, where the soft chalk was quarried and worked underground, and the workshop his team uncovered at Lathes in 2017 was a quarry cave in Galilee, a few miles from Nazareth, with the cores and the failed roughs still lying where the workers left them. That is the detail I keep returning to. Within an easy walk of the village where the family in this story lived, there was a hillside where men cut chalk out of the ground and turned it on a lathe into jars that could not become unclean. The 6 vessels standing against that wall were local industry. They also tell us something the texts alone could not. The sheer spread of these vessels, the fact that they are found in modest houses and not only in priestly quarters, says that ordinary Galilean families were keeping purity practices seriously, at real expense, in their own kitchens. Whatever else was true of village religion, it was not casual. Which brings us to what the water in those jars was actually for. Not drinking, the household drank from the cistern or the spring. The water in the stone jars was for purification, for the washing of hands before eating, and for the washing of vessels and of guests, the practice the account calls the purifying of the Jews. Hand-washing before a meal was not about dirt. It was a ritual act with a fixed form, water poured from a vessel over the hands, in a set quantity, in a set order. It required clean water, held in a vessel that was itself beyond suspicion, available in quantity at the moment people sat down to eat. Now multiply that by a week of open hosting, every guest, every meal, every day, for 7 days. 6 large stone jars along the wall is not excessive for a house preparing to feed a village. It is exactly what you would need. So the jars were empty or low by the time we meet them, which is why the instruction given to the servants is to fill them with water, and why the account says they filled them to the brim. Consider what that instruction actually cost the people who received it. Water in a hill village came from one of 2 places. Either there was a spring, usually at the foot of the slope, which meant carrying uphill, or there were cisterns, bell-shaped chambers cut down into the rock, plastered to hold water, fed by channels that collected the winter rain off the roofs and the yards. Kirbit Kana has them cut all over the hill. A household relied on them from the end of the rains in spring until the rains returned. Either way, the water came up by hand. A jar on the shoulder or the head holds perhaps 12 or 15 liters, and it is heavy and it is awkward, and the carrying was women's work done early in the day in company as a social occasion as much as a chore. Now fill 6 vessels of 100 liters each, to the brim in the middle of a wedding with the courtyard full of guests. That is something in the order of 40 or 50 journeys with a full jar, up whatever slope stood between the house and the water, in and out past people who were eating. Nobody in that account complains and nobody explains, but the servants did the work, and it is the kind of work that leaves you certain about what you put in. Which is exactly why the gospel bothers to tell us they knew. Before we go on, it is worth knowing what wine was in this world, because the modern word carries assumptions that do not belong here. Wine was the ordinary table drink of the whole Mediterranean, and it was drunk by everybody, at every meal, including children. Water alone was often unsafe and frequently unpleasant. Wine was the way a household drank. It was made in the autumn, trodden in rock-cut presses, fermented in jars and stored, and by spring the previous year's vintage was what you had. And it was mixed. This is the part most often left out. The usual proportion was 1 part wine to 3 parts water, and in the Greek world drinking wine, unmixed, was considered the mark of a barbarian or a drunkard. The mixing was done in a bowl by the person responsible for the table, and the strength was a decision somebody made deliberately. It is worth putting the rest of the table in front of you as well, because a feast in a village of this size was not a banquet in the Roman sense, and it was not a modern wedding breakfast either. The staple was bread, and a great deal of it baked flat in a domed clay oven in the courtyard or on a heated stone. With it went olives, olive oil for dipping, cheese from goat's milk, lentils, chickpeas, onions and garlic, dried figs pressed into cakes, raisins, honey if there was any, and salt fish carried up from the lake. Meat was the marker. An ordinary household ate meat rarely at the festivals and at events like this. Killing an animal for the table was itself the announcement that the occasion was serious, and the animal would be shared out among everybody present. That is a large part of what a wedding cost. There is one more clue hiding in the steward's title. The Greek word buried inside it is triclinen, the 3-couch dining room of the Greek and Roman world, where diners reclined on their left elbows around 3 sides of a low table. That style had reached Galilee. Whether a village house at Cana had proper couches or simply cushions and mats on the floor, the vocabulary used to describe the room is Greek, and it is a small reminder that this was not a sealed-off world. That responsibility belonged to a specific office, and the account names it. The Greek word is architraklinos, literally the ruler of the 3 couches, the man in charge of the dining room. Some translations call him the governor of the feast, some the master of the banquet, some the steward. Whoever he was, a hired professional at a wealthy wedding, a senior relative at a village one. His job was the practical management of the table. He decided the mixing, he directed the servants, he tasted what was going out. He was, in effect, the person whose reputation was bound up with the quality of what the guests were handed. Which means he is the perfect witness, and the account uses him as one. He is not in on anything. He does not know where the wine has come from. He tastes it in the ordinary way, doing his job, and he reacts. The steward tastes it and says something that has the ring of a man repeating a piece of trade wisdom he has said 100 times. Every man at the beginning doth set forth good wine, and when men have well drunk, then that which is worse. But thou hast kept the good wine until now. That is a joke, and it is a joke about hosting. The custom he is describing is real and slightly grubby. You serve your best at the start, when everybody is sober and paying attention and will remember it. And once the palates have dulled, you bring out the cheaper stuff, because nobody will notice and nobody will say. Everybody at that wedding would have known the practice. So the steward's line is not reverent. It is a man clapping the bridegroom on the shoulder and saying, "You have done this backwards," and it is the best possible evidence, because it is the reaction of somebody who has no idea he is a witness to anything. Stay where you are, there is more to come. If you subscribe, it genuinely helps this channel, and there is a new one every day. walking through the life of Jesus. And if there is a passage or a moment you would like looked at closely, say so in the comments, and those are the ones we go to next. Notice also who he says it to. He calls the bridegroom because the bridegroom is the host, and this is the host's doing. The credit lands on the family whose week it was, publicly, in front of everybody who had been about to talk about them. The failure is not merely repaired, it is reversed into the opposite reputation. So sit for a moment with what the servants were holding, because they are the only other people in the room who know. They had carried the water. 6 jars filled to the brim is a great deal of hauling from a village well or cistern. Hours of work with a bucket and a rope, in and out of a courtyard full of guests. They knew what had gone into those jars, because their arms knew. And then they drew some out and carried it to the steward, and it was not what they had put in. The account says plainly that the servants which drew the water knew. Nobody announces it. There is no proclamation, no crowd, no demonstration to the courtyard. The bridegroom is complimented, and the feast carries on, and the people who understand what has happened are a mother, some disciples, and a handful of servants with wet sleeves. 600 liters is about 800 bottles as we would count them, and this is after the wine had already run out and the guests had already been drinking for days. It is far more than the wedding needed. It is a quantity that would have gone home with people in jugs and lasted a village family months. That excess is not a rounding error in the story. It is the point of it. Whatever else this account is doing, it is not describing a careful, measured solution to a shortfall. It describes a village house suddenly holding more good wine than it had ever held, at the end of a week when the household had already given everything it had. And it is described as the first of the signs. The Gospel of John does not call these events miracles. It calls them signs, and it counts them, and it says this one was the beginning. Signs point somewhere. The word itself refuses to let the event sit as a wonder for its own sake. What is worth noticing is where the first one is placed, not in the temple, not in front of a crowd of thousands, not at a moment of national crisis, not to a ruler or a priest or an army. At a family wedding in a hill village, to save an ordinary household from an ordinary humiliation, witnessed mainly by staff. There is a whole theology in the choice of venue, and it does not need much help from me. The first thing done is done at a party, for a young couple nobody has ever named, about something as unimportant as the drink running low, and the people who see it clearly are the ones carrying the jars. And notice who is never named. We do not know the bridegroom's name. We do not know the bride's. They are the 2 people the entire week was for. They are the reason everybody is in the room, and the gospel does not tell us who they were and never comes back to them. There is one thread worth pulling, though it proves nothing. Later in the same gospel, we are told that Nathanael was of Cana in Galilee, which makes him a man from this village, who is standing among the disciples who were invited. It is not evidence that the wedding was his family's. It is a reminder that these were not strangers passing through a place on a map. Somebody in that group was from there. The village comes back once more, too. When Jesus returns to Galilee later and heals a court official's son, the account locates it carefully. He came again into Cana of Galilee, where he made the water wine. The writer expects you to remember the address. Now a coda, because the jars themselves have an ending. The stone vessel industry does not last. It flourishes for something over a century, from the late 1st century before Christ, and then the whole industry stops within a generation of the year 70, when the temple was destroyed and the world those purity practices were oriented toward came apart. There is an argument among archaeologists about exactly how fast it declined and whether it lingered longer in Galilee than in Judea. What is not in dispute is the shape of the curve. The workshops at Hisma go quiet, the quarry caves fill with debris, the lathes stop. You can date a Galilean house by these fragments, almost like tree rings. Chalk mugs in the fill mean somebody was living there before the war. Their absence in the layer above means the world changed, which means the 6 jars in that room belong to a narrow window, perhaps 150 years, in one small region when a particular set of people were making a particular expensive choice about how to keep a law. The account happens to record a household that had made it. And at Khirbet Khana today there is a hilltop with the remains of a village on it. House walls, cisterns, a press, the outline of a public building, and a set of caves on the slope which pilgrims used for centuries as a place to remember the wedding. Nobody can prove which room the jars stood in. There are broken chalk vessels in the soil there, as there are across the whole of Galilee. There is one more reason the venue is not incidental, and it is the reason a 1st century Jewish reader would have felt before a modern reader notices it. The wedding is the oldest picture in the Hebrew scriptures for what God is doing with a people. Hosea is told to take a wife, and the whole book becomes an argument about faithfulness. Isaiah says that as the bridegroom rejoiceth over the bride, so shall thy God rejoice over thee. Jeremiah remembers the kindness of youth and the love of espousals. The image is not a decoration laid over the theology. It is one of the load-bearing walls. And it is a picture Jesus uses about himself, plainly and early. Asked why his disciples do not fast, he answers with a question about a wedding. Can the children of the bride chamber fast while the bridegroom is with them? The claim inside that sentence is enormous, and he makes it in the mildest possible terms, by pointing at the room everybody has just been sitting in. The last book of the Bible closes the same way. It does not end with a throne room or a battlefield, but with a marriage supper, and with a city described as a bride adorned for her husband. So the first sign is placed inside the picture. A house that has run out, a host who cannot fix it, a week of hospitality about to fail, and a supply arriving from outside the household's own resources in a quantity nobody could use up. You do not need to force that into an allegory. It is enough to notice that of all the places to begin, it began at a wedding, and that whoever wrote it down knew exactly what a wedding already meant. So take the ordinary things with you, rather than the extraordinary one. A family walked 9 miles across a valley to a cousin's wedding and stayed a week. A contract was read out and witnessed, with a sum written into it that would keep a young woman from destitution if the worst happened, because her father had insisted on it and the law was on his side. Neighbors arrived carrying what they could spare and kept a quiet account of it and expected the same in their turn. 6 carved stone jars stood along a wall because a household in a small village had decided, at real cost, that it wanted to keep the law properly. And when the thing every host fears actually happened, and the wine failed in front of the whole village on the family's 1 week, the repair came quietly through the back of the house and was handed to a steward who did not know what he was tasting. That is the shape of it, The need was small and public. The answer was large and almost private. And it arrived through the most ordinary objects in the room. The water jars nobody had looked at twice, standing along a wall, waiting to be filled. If you are lying awake tonight turning over something that feels too small to be worth mentioning, that is the detail to hold. The first sign in that gospel was not about a kingdom or an army or a plague. It was about a family that had run short, at a party, in a village too small to be on most maps. Nobody in that courtyard was doing anything remarkable. They were hosting badly, carrying water, mixing wine, keeping accounts of who had brought what, and trying to get through a week without disgracing a young couple whose names we will never learn. The help, when it came, went straight into the vessels they already owned and were already holding. Sleep well, the jars were already in the room.